Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, I joined by two scholars, Professor Anna Fitzgerald and Professor Laurie Freeman, a long-serving political economy analyst in Africa. Professor Anna Fitzgerald is international security expert. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
In this episode, we're going to discuss the ongoing situation in Ethiopia. And what do you know about the ongoing situation this time around? Professor Laurie Freeman.
Well, what we know is that we just heard this morning from the special envoy to Ethiopia, Mr. Feltman, speaking in Washington, D.C. this morning. And the United States now is going to increase the pressure on the Ethiopian government to declare a ceasefire and to negotiate with the TPLF. And there's also a news report that's just come out a few minutes ago that the United States is planning on removing Ethiopia from AGOA, which will obviously hurt the people who are working in Ethiopia and will have an effect, obviously, on the poor and the economy. So right now, the U.S. is in a pressure mode, threatening sanctions, the cutoff of AGOA, to force the government of Prime Minister Abiy to have a ceasefire and negotiate. And that's what we have from this side in Washington today.
All right. What about Professor Anna?
Well, I would agree with what Professor Freeman has already said, but I would add that these are worrying developments because, again, we're seeing punitive measures being lodged towards one side of the party only. And the longer that punitive measures are not lodged to the other side of the conflict, the TPLF, the lack of incentive they have to stop the fighting. And the ENDF is holding its position, it appears, in Afar and Amara. The insurrectionist movement across those borders has come into Kombolcha and Dessie, two very strategic areas in Amhara. In fact, very close to, if not on, the lifeline of the country, which is the road between Addis and Djibouti. So there have been very worrying developments. We're also reading in local media that groups of Tigrayan ethnic origin have been armed and have attacked federal forces from the rear. And so we've seen quite a lot of battlefield activity around Kutabur, Dessie, and Kombolcha. We're also hearing that federal forces have recaptured some of the northern Wollo districts, like Gashina and others. So it seems like we're seeing the war playing out in Wollo now. And whilst these punitive measures have come from the US government, we're seeing words like siege and blockade repeated, but many are asking questions as to what blockade and what siege the US government is referring to here. The Ethiopian government was supporting the delivery of humanitarian aid since the word go in Tigray. It has tried to maintain a defensive posture against the cross-border incursions of the TPLF, which any national government is absolutely entitled to do to protect its communities. But at the same time, without punitive measures being lodged towards the TPLF insurgents, there is no incentive to stop the fighting and put a halt to what effectively has become killing fields across Amhara.
The Tigrayan forces are trying to capture provinces and towns in Amhara, specifically in Wollo, and they are vandalizing resources and looting private and public properties. But the US and European Union have never said about this destruction. What do you say about that, Professor Laurie Freeman?
what we're seeing right now is that the United States, under the presidency of Joe Biden for now, I guess, 10 months, is losing its influence in the Horn of Africa. And I just recently released a statement where I made clear that if the United States government and the Biden administration, when they came into power in January, had supported Prime Minister Abiy and supported the sovereignty of Ethiopia, that the TPLF, they would have lost their momentum if they had to, and they would have withered on the vine without the involvement of the United States and the West by continuing to threaten and place sanctions on the Ethiopian government. I mean, and there's also a resolution now in the Congress, which has not been voted up yet, House Resolution 455, where all of the punitive measures are against the Ethiopian government. In fact, there's very little you can do to a rebel force, but they can implement many measures against the government, which will be harmful to the people. So right now, the West, and led by the United States and others, is playing a very dangerous role, because if they continue to undermine Prime Minister Abiy, then they are possibly creating the danger of Ethiopia having more conflicts with more ethnic rebel insurrectionists attacking the government, and you could see the breakup of Ethiopia. In fact, some analysts have already said that they see Ethiopia as resembling what happened in Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. But of course, that's not true. You have a government, you have an elected government, you have a constitution, and all these various regions of the Ethiopia join and sign on to the 1995 constitution, which respects the government. And now you have an overt attempt against the government. And the United States should be supporting the government against this insurrection. And instead, it's giving tacit support to the TPLF and punishing Ethiopia. And the removal from AGOA trade relations would be another severe attack on the very people of Ethiopia. And if you put this in conjunction with what's happened in Sudan, where the United States has had a disastrous policy for over 20 years in Sudan, the United States is losing its influence in the Horn of Africa. And if it loses its longtime ally, Ethiopia, by turning it into an enemy, this would make the United States irrelevant in a large part of Africa. And so that's something that we've got to change for the benefit of the United States, but for the benefit of Ethiopia and Africa as well. To support the nation state and the sovereignty of Ethiopia should be the primary policy of the U.S. government.
Okay, Professor Anna, do you have something to add on?
Well, I would only agree with what Professor Freeman has said. I mean, the Ethiopia sits in a very geostrategically important part of the world. Its potential is rich. The potential across the region is rich. Why threads of instability appear to be being supported in short-term interests as opposed to long-term visionary interests seem to be being pursued is a question that many of us are asking. I think there is a supply chain here in this misinformation feed. Global policy makers follow the reports of major mainstream media outlets. Mainstream media outlets have demonstrated a bias towards TPLF insurgents and the dominant narrative that was emerging right from the outset of the country. And of course, this narrative pays very little consideration to the communities across northern Ethiopia who have been very significantly affected by this fighting and this prolonged and protracted conflict. These reports of mainstream media have been influenced by the ongoing digital insurgency. And don't forget, the new form of warfare is multi-platformed, non-kinetic, non-traditional, multi-domained. And this virtual domain is playing a big role. And you know, it looks like it's not just media picking up this dominant narrative, but analysts as well. the problem facing the policy communities is that having put their stake in the ground very firmly in some cases at the front end of this conflict, I think some actors are having a very difficult time admitting that they may have got the facts wrong and the analysis slightly incorrect at the front end. And so having created a platform in many respects is very, very difficult to climb down from that now. And I suspect some were very convinced by the information insurgency narrative that came at the world like a tsunami between November and April of last year. And so, you know, it's not. I think we're also ignoring the fact that it's the Ethiopian people that have have not only chosen their government, but they have chosen democracy as well, and are in no way interested in an oppressive dictatorial form of governance that was the governance culture under the TPLF. Lawrence has mentioned AGOA. You know, the threats and these punitive measures to take trade opportunities that empower many women in Ethiopia, that bring economic trade to at an interregional level. These are important supporters for sustainable development goals that the international development organizations have been supporting for years. And it seems ludicrous to try to unravel all of that development that countries like the United States have supported Ethiopia with, as have many other donor organizations.
I appreciate it. All right. Ever since TPLF has been formed as a political party, neither served Tigrayans nor Ethiopians in its reign. Rather, political analysts criticize and claim that TPLF executes other actors' interest in the Horn and in Ethiopia. Do you agree TPLF's baggage is stuffed with Egyptians, Sudanese, and the US's interest? Do you agree, Professor Laurie Freeman?
I think it's more complicated than that. It's not simply the same interest as Egypt and Sudan. The TPLF is violating the law because the region of Tigray, which is one of 10 regions, when they violated the law by having their own election in September, when there were no elections, the elections were postponed due to COVID-19, and when they attacked the military outpost, the TPLF, not the Tigrayan people, became an enemy of the state, an enemy of the nation. And therefore the government in Addis had a responsibility to preserve the integrity of the nation state of Ethiopia. And that's what it has done. And as has been pointed out in this discussion, also by Anne, is the narrative from the beginning was very clear. I've been involved in African politics for over 30 years. And right away, within a very short period of time, there were accusations of genocide and ethnicity and ethnic cleansing. So the minute I heard that, I knew there was an operation afoot, because those are always the code words for disrupting a nation. And those became the narrative. And the narrative is two warring parties or ethnic parties. And that's not the case. The government is not a warring party. It's the nation of Ethiopia defending its integrity. What you have is a situation similar, not identical, to what we had in the United States in the Civil War. You have a nation defending the Union. And that's what Abraham Lincoln did. And he constantly carried out his policies that saving the Union was the most important thing that he had accomplished against an attempt to break it up. And that's what the people in Washington, and I don't think President Biden is well informed. He has a group of advisors like Anthony Blinken and Samantha Power and Susan Rice and others who have a particular view of Africa and they want to impose their dictatorship of democracy, so-called, on Africa and on Ethiopia. And Prime Minister Abiy has refused to go along and is pushing a different direction for development of Ethiopia, not beholden to the West. And there are forces in the United States and around the world, I would call it a political financial oligarchy, who want to see Ethiopia dismembered. And they're even willing to see the entire Horn of Africa destroyed. I mean, even the situation in Sudan, the only response the United States has is to cut off aid. Is that what a great power should be doing? Is the only thing we could do is cut off aid, issue sanctions, deny people the privilege of selling their goods at a reduced rate of tariffs? It's rather pathetic and impotent that the United States cannot actually see a better policy for development. And this is what has been missing. The United States and the whole Horn of Africa, I spent 15 years in Sudan, has not had a concept that what Africa needs is development. They need electricity, which Ethiopia is providing with the dam. They need development. They need manufacturing. They need infrastructure. And the United States and the West ignores this and instead says, no, these countries have to abide by our rules of democracy. And I don't think the president knows, although maybe people in his cabinet or advisors do, but if you dismember Ethiopia, you will unleash hell in the Horn of Africa for 300 million people, which will overflow into the rest of the continent. So this would be the stupidest and most dangerous thing if the United States continues to pursue this hard line, which could lead to more destabilizations in Ethiopia. And the TPLF may have been set off. This may have been a setup from the beginning to drag Ethiopia down when it was the leading economic nation in development, light manufacturing, energy, transportation. So the whole operation may have been a setup against the nation of Ethiopia, which the this president and the past president both have fell into in their way to conducting U.S. foreign policy.
Would you think this sanction imposition would resolve the ongoing conflict and the ongoing situation in Ethiopia?
Absolutely not. And I'll go back to what I said earlier on about punitive measures. So first of all, the world seems to be using either one extreme of tools from the peace and security toolbox or the other extreme. So some countries have been very quiet and have just issued or repeated calls of concern, condemnation. Some countries have supported Ethiopia, like other sub-Saharan African countries, Russia, China, India, and others, but others have been very, very vocal, very accusatory, refusing to stand behind what is a legitimate government. And let's just look at the equity behind this legitimacy. Approximately 80 people voted in the recent national election. The figure was about 75% of eligible voters, but then after 6.6 million further members of the population voted between September 1st and September 10th, that boosted the numbers up to something like 80% of those eligible to vote. That is a very, very high figure, not only for the African continent, but for the world. So this was a legitimate election. It was reported on by over 100,000 local observers as a free, fair, and transparent election, and over 100 international observers as a free, fair, peaceful, and transparent election. It's a great shame that there has been a conflict in the north of the country that has prevented people from voting. But if you take that into consideration, the rest of the country effectively got up and demonstrated not only its support for the election, but its commitment for a democratic pathway that even in the midst of conflict, it would get up and make efforts to vote for. So by taking these policies forward, the United States government is effectively ignoring the will of over 100 million people that have voted for this pathway, who have voted against the TPLF's type of governance culture, ideology, etc. I mean, the TPLF leadership from the very beginning of the conflict, and the beginning of the conflict for me dates way back from last November 4th. We saw things put in place that indicated a pathway of measures that set things up to get worse. And it seems that widespread democratic peace and more even and fair sense of development run counter to the TPLF's notion of how Ethiopia should have developed as a nation. Let's not forget that for many years, the TPLF's strategy was to purposely maintain levels of poverty and underdevelopment in the peripheral regions of the country, which would allow them to maintain heavy central control. Development requires the liberalization of the market economy. This was also not in the TPLF's interests because it would erode its embezzled finances, savings, money extracted through the parastatal model and the economic model involving parastatals and privately held finances. And so this conflict goes way beyond differences in opinion of the type of model, the governance model and the ethnic federalist model in Ethiopia. And that's the line that many analysts have taken. This is a war about finance, economics, and power grabs.
Professor Lori, recently you've been heard criticizing the US government, saying the Biden administration should correct its policy in the Horn region. And would you like to recite it for us again?
Well, my consideration, and I've been, as I said, I've been working in Africa for over 3 decades, is there's only the pathway of development should be primary. In other words, how do we improve the standard of living of Africans so that they have a life where they have normal conditions, where they can get food, where they can get water, where they can have electricity in their home, where they can get a paycheck to raise a family, pay for the house, pay for electricity, so the children can study into the night if they have to. These are the conditions that we expect in the West, but we do not actually advocate them for development of Africa. And in fact, over the recent week, we've seen statements from both the Uganda President Museveni, President Yoweri Museveni, and President of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari, both criticizing the COP26 conference in Glasgow because they're trying to limit the amount of energy that Africans should have. And the lack of energy, the lack of electricity, is what's killing Africa. So therefore, a U.S. policy should be always oriented towards development. How do we reduce poverty? Although I want to eliminate poverty. How do you improve the standard of living? And that should be the discussion between the United States and African leaders and all leaders around the world. And this is something that has become absent from the United States. The last president we had who understood and cared about the development of Africa was John F. Kennedy. And that was a long time ago. I'm probably the only one here who was alive during that time. But he cared about it. He established relations with African leaders such as Nkrumah to build the energy complex on the Volta River. The United States now has given up this concept of development. In fact, we're anti-development. There should have been a letter of praise and commendation for the progress that Ethiopia is making on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which will contribute 6,200 megawatts, the most power that is going to be added to Africa in the next 2 years. And as Anne pointed out, the United States has virtually refused to even recognize that an election took place. In fact, the House Resolution 455 doesn't recognize it at all and says we have to have democracy in Ethiopia when we have tens of millions of Ethiopians who stood online to vote. And the United States doesn't even observe this as legitimate. So that we've had a real backward a backward turn has taken place in the United States, where we no longer understand that the role of development for Africa, as it is for all people, as it is in the United States itself, is what our policy should be based on. And we've now accepted a different view of Africa, and we're opposed to these kinds of progress. And we're now putting ourselves in a position where we're losing massive influence. China has moved with the Belt and Road to build infrastructure, which is necessary and correct. And the United States is moving towards supporting destabilizations of an ally that has been key to the security and stabilization of the Horn of Africa. So if my country has any wisdom, any brains left in the Congress or the executive branch, we must immediately reverse this policy, eliminate the sanctions, restore AGOA, and support the government of Prime Minister Abiy. That is what is necessary for the protection and well-being of not only Ethiopia, but the whole Horn of Africa.
Professor Anna, do you agree with Professor Lori's outlook regarding the U.S. policy in the whole region?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, let me take a slightly complementary view to Professor Freeman's. I'm a professor of international security, so let's look at this from a security angle too. There is well accepted and well developed standard practice across Western countries and within NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, about how countries should handle incidents like Ethiopia faced. Unprovoked, brutal attack on the national interests of the country. In Ethiopia's case, it was an attack against the federal forces, which resulted in the murder of thousands of officers and soldiers. Any country in the Western Hemisphere, any civilized country, would deploy all national instruments of power to respond to that incident, to that type of incident, and diffuse the threat. And that is what the Ethiopian government did. It launched a law enforcement operation that aligned to that well-accepted NATO standard practice in Europe and North America of what we call military aid to the civil authorities or military aid to the civil power. Let's compare it to what happened following the US elections almost a year ago on Capitol Hill. The police were deployed, and then very quickly the National Guard, which is part of the US military, became deployed to diffuse that threat. And 643 people were arrested as a result of that. And yet, the Abiy government and how it responded to this attempted coup and insurrection was, by way of mainstream media and some policy corridors, wrong in doing what they did. Not according to Western standard practice. And one could even question, as Professor John Abink has argued in some of his recent writing, that another standard practice would be to reach out to neighbors and neighboring countries for assistance on these matters. And that turning to neighboring Eritrea for support in diffusing this threat, especially after Eritrea itself was a target of 2 rocket attacks launched by the TPLF leaders, is also entirely reasonable. So I just wanted to look at this through a national security lens. Lawrence talked a lot about development and development priorities and projects, which I absolutely agree with. I mean, the Gerd Dam is a national water infrastructure project. Why it became an issue discussed at the UN Security Council seemed to be all part and parcel with the conflict narrative and the geopolitics surrounding that conflict narrative. I mean, the GERD will not only bring a huge amount of support to all Ethiopia's development goals and the global community's sustainable development goals for Ethiopia, but it will bring great benefits to partners like Sudan, Egypt, Sudan flood defenses, water security, and in a country where food subsidies have gone through the roof and where the basic means of survival are at stake for a lot of Sudanese communities, food security is very important. Egypt was concerned about water levels. Those concerns have been allayed. So the global community should really be supporting the riparian states themselves to engage in regional economic cooperation using the fruits of the GERD. And actually, if countries like the United States and others really cared about the water production in the region, they would pay attention to threats like the water hyacinths problem in the Nile. And knowing that Ethiopia boasts or hosts 85% of the Nile, there are issues like these weeds in the Nile, the water hyacinth, that are reducing and have the potential to reduce the levels of the river by significant amounts if attention is not given to this. That would cause more of an issue to the national security interests of Egypt, Sudan, and the riparian states. So there should be support for these things. And as Professor Freeman says, they are development issues.
Appreciate it. After TPLF captured some towns in Wallo, killed civilians and looted so many private and public properties, but the Western media still became reluctant to report this atrocious act. What does this show, Professor Lowry?
It's clear that the media has been involved in this campaign against Ethiopia from the very beginning. The media is not independent, they're not objective, they're not truth seekers. They're very political, and they actually attach themselves to the same political leadership that we see attacking Ethiopia. When the CNN was virtually operating as an arm of the insurrectionists and was putting out various forms of propaganda, at one point hosted a meeting which included the UN envoy, Linda Thomas Greenfield, and I believe Samantha Power. And the CNN was acting as if they were conducting US foreign policy. And then, of course, the Congress, which has very little to any understanding of Africa or African nations or anything going on in Africa.
What we've seen is a reluctance of Western media and humanitarian partners to work inside Amhara and across the North Wallo districts. Let's not forget that what the international humanitarian partners are effectively working with and under in Tigray is a lack of governance capacity. And that governance capacity is prioritizing an armed insurgency. So there's no doubt in my mind that humanitarian groups will be working in an environment of threat and intimidation. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why they have not been so engaged in the Amhara and Afar regions. I think that the heavy fighting is probably another reason why you don't have media reporting from this area, although we've seen some local media reporting and some international journalists have come into the region. But counterinsurgency warfare is made up of three elements. One is the fighters, the guerrillas themselves at the front line. Another element is the auxiliary, what's called the auxiliary, those that feed information into the communities, keeping the communities and the people on side because it's known as a people's war. And it's in the insurgents' interest to keep the people supporting the insurgency narrative. And then lastly, something called the underground. And the underground in the past in campaigns like Algeria, Philippines, Vietnam, Dhofar, Malaya. This underground capacity was used for logistics, administration, observing human behavior, like an intelligence capacity. And of course, this underground capacity plays out on the internet these days. So information flows are an important aspect of this conflict. And it's really important for analysts and international policymakers to make extra efforts to analyze not only the virtual domain, but analyze the dynamics of other platforms with ground-based realities and feeds coming from communities across Ethiopia that represent the mainstay of the population. So the atrocities across Amhara are horrific, and let's just unpack some of these. Youth are being killed, people of all ages are being killed, properties are being ransacked, businesses are being looted, the agricultural crop is being uprooted and taken back by the TPLF fighters across back into Tigray. And this is part of an insurgents campaign as well, because what insurgents seek to do is delegitimize the legitimate government. And so the more TPLF fighters loot these areas, the more the uprooted Amharan communities will stand to lose. And the entity that they will blame for that loss is the Ethiopian government. So this is all part of insurgency warfare, insurgency tactics. And it seems, as I said earlier, that the war is now playing out in Wollo. And I think what we need to watch and wait for is the extent to which the ENDF will be able to defend against a more conventional style warfare, which it seems to now be encircling based on the recaptured areas in the North Wollo district and having TPLF fighters both in Kombolcha and Dessie. So no doubt it will be protecting the main artery between Addis and Djibouti, a real lifeline for the country. And I think over the last few days, we've seen troops amassing on both sides towards these areas. So seems like very sadly and tragically, the final showdown might be playing out in Wollo. Well, I would finish by perhaps saying that we can only hope that the global community can issue its warnings and its punitive measures towards the TPLF leaders, why they seem to be why they aren't receiving these threats and punitive measures surprises many of us. And the threats of punitive action should be lodged towards them. These actions can include the freezing of bank accounts, travel restrictions, taking possession of overseas properties, and possibly, as some members of the global community have started to do, more of an acknowledgement that there have been flaws in the conflict narrative, and that failure to act now very decisively in the Horn of Africa will only risk widening the killing fields that the TPLF is perpetrating. I think as far as the Ethiopian government is concerned, it needs to use its intelligence assets to track the sources and movements of weapons being fired into communities, being used against the national instruments of power, trying to diffuse this threat. If the government forces have, as we understand, they have recaptured northern Wollo districts, these forces need to be protected from the back. And lastly, that the rest of Ethiopian society needs to come together stand by its belief in not only the truth, but in democracy. The biggest asset for a country and the biggest form of national resilience is founded within the population, society, and the people. So although what we're experiencing at the moment is sad, horrific, very tragic, we hope that there are better days to come for Ethiopia when the rest of the 9 regions will be joined with their northern Ethiopian brothers and sisters, including their Tigrayan communities. Thank you very much.